So we are at the Corning Museum of Glass. It's July 31st at about, I think, 1 p.m. I'm here with David Stafford. My name is Rebecca Hopman. I work in the library. And Dave, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Dave Stafford. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not from these shores. Came over to the US around, exactly November the 16th, 2000. Had worked for Corning all of my life. Joined Corning when I was 16 in England. Corning had a plant, a glass manufacturing plant that manufactured Pyrex glass in a town called Sunderland, which is on the northeast coast of the UK, about 80 miles shy of the Scottish border. And they'd had a plant there for a long time. I think when Corning owned that plant, it was the oldest plant that Corning owned, and glass manufacturing on that site had gone back to the late 1700s. And it had evolved and modified and grown and got larger. And James A. Jobling was the name of the company when I joined it, which was the same year that Corning acquired full ownership of that. So basically when I joined, Corning bought it. And I think they'd had a part ownership in it prior to that, but they took on whole ownership at that point. And so I continued working with them and rose through the ranks. They put me through college, and I gained a diploma in glass technology. And that was the beginning of my career in the UK. And then I moved over, as I said, to the USA. My wife, Jan, which is short for Janet, she came over with me. We've been married now. We just celebrated our 35th wedding anniversary. And she joined Corning when we came over. So prior to that, she was in the academia at the university there. And so that was how I became a US resident.
Great. So I was wondering if you could tell me when and where you were born.
Okay, I was born in the city of Sunderland. It's a city, just to give you an idea of how large it is. When I left, it was a population of around 350,000, so considerably larger than Corning. And it had a big shipbuilding and coal mining industry there, and a car manufacturing. Nissan built a plant there, and they manufactured cars there in the 10 years that I was there prior to me leaving to come here. But obviously one of the big employers there as well was Corning, or the glass industry. And Corning was by far the largest glass manufacturer. There's only two that I can recall. Corning was the largest, and there was a very small antique glass maker not far from where Corning's plant was. And so that's the city I came from. My wife was from the same city. And Corning, when I joined, it's hard to believe, had 7,500 employees in that one site.
Oh, wow.
And the day I left had 140 employees. So you can see how that evolved. But I would say they still manufacture the same tonnage of glass.
Wow.
So a praise for efficiency, I would say.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you started working at age 16. So what kind of education or training had you had at that point to lead up to that job?
Right. So I would classify my education at that as kind of middle basic. It was the standard for that time. And you have to remember, it's a different time. Mm-hmm. It's a different culture. So even culturally, the transitions don't translate, if you like. But I had a general standard of education, what we called O levels at that point, and it was a basic, saying that you had a basic and good understanding of general history, geography, maths, etc. And it was an industrial town. Mm-hmm. You know, you either went into building ships, you either did that, or you dug coal out the ground, or you went into the glass industry. Mm-hmm. And in those days, it was quite a bit of also who you knew and not just what you knew. And I remember going down to the careers office, and it was fresh out of school, 16-year-old. It was scary at the same time and exciting at the same time. And I said to the guy, "Have you got any jobs?" And he said, "Do you want to go into the glass industry?" And I said, "Sure, I'll give it a try, you know." And he said, "Okay, you got an interview, be there in 2 hours' time, and see Mr. Gledhill, who's going to give you an interview, and take it from there." And so he said it was, in the town, the general population called it Pyrex. They didn't call it Corning or James A. Jobling. They would say, oh, you work at Pyrex. So Pyrex became the name of the plant, if you like. A bit like people say Hoover when they mean a vacuum cleaner, you know. And so on the way there to my interview, I called my mum in a phone box, in a British red phone box there. Hi Mom, I said, they've given me an interview for a job at Pyrex. What do you know about Pyrex? And she says, oh, it's a great company to work for. You know, if you can get in there, that'll be a great start. You know, she said, I used to work there years ago when she was just out of school, and all she did was pack glass at that time. It was kind of a transitional job. And so she said, great move, you know, if you can get in. So I thought, well, I'll go and give this a try. Went in, and it was really the shortest, most impromptu interview I'd ever had. Well, actually, it was the only interview I ever had for a job. And I went in, and he went through the basics, which school, you know, do you have any relatives that work here? And I said, no, but my mom used to work here. Oh, okay. And it seemed, in retrospect, like a very short, cursory interview. And he just said, can you start on Monday?
Oh my gosh.
And I said, sure. And so I didn't even know what job I was applying for. I just knew I had a job. At least that's what my grey matter tells me now. And I remember I was dressed in my best suit and tie, and it was of the age, this was 1973, and Elton John was all the rage, and I had these most horrendously wide flared trousers on, and these platform shoes. I don't know if you ever see the movie Tommy, with like 8-inch platform shoes, a big wide collared shirt with a big knot, and I thought I looked great. Obviously it didn't deter from giving me the job or getting me the job, but as I came out of the office there was a long winding staircase. This was a building that was built in the 1800s, and I had to come navigate this winding staircase, and my big platform shoes didn't fit the stairs, and I came rolling down the stairs and crashed in a heap at the bottom of the stairs. And in those days we had security guards called commissionaires who were dressed in almost a formal Navy officer's uniform with a white peak cap, and they had all of their medals and badges on. They were ex-military men who worked now in security, and this big strapping guy came out and looked down at me and said, "Are you all right, lad?" And I said, "Yes, I am, sir." And he says, "Did you get the job?" And I said, "I did, I got the job." He says, "Well, take care," he says, "and see if you can last the week, will you? We don't want you to die on the job the first week." And he pulled me up, dusted me down, and that was me. I was into the glass industry, and so it moved on.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that Corning did send you to get a glass
Yes,
certificate.
yes.
What was involved in that?
Well, as it turned out, what I'd been hired as was a manager's trainee. And what they were looking for, they'd brought 6 guys in, or 6 young men. And in those days, I'm afraid there wasn't that balance between male and female. It was kind of a male-dominated business. And there was, you know, women were secretaries and people who packed glass, and men were the guys that worked on the heavy industrial shop floor. But what they'd hired me for, and the 5 other guys that joined with me, were as to be a management trainee, which involved spending a month in every single department, every single aspect of the glass business, and they wanted you over a period of 2 or 3 years to gain an insight and a knowledge of how the whole business worked. So that when you were operating, say, in the glass manufacturing area, you knew all of the steps and all of the process that came before you and all of them after you. And their hope was that over time you would get to the point where you could be an effective manager in later years, having gained all this knowledge and worked in all the areas. And as a function of that 3-year training period, they also sent you to college. So you went on a night class basis, so you worked all day and then you went to night class and you learned about glass technology, about some of the forming techniques, the science, the chemistry around that. And we would go around the UK, you know, once every 3 or 4 months we would go and visit a specialist college or a specialist university and learn from a professor certain aspects that were scientific or to do with glass manufacturing. We would visit other glass plants and see different technologies in operation than we used at our facility. So they were trying to broaden our experiences in that regard. And after 3 years, I got the diploma. And but before I got to my 3 years of a month in every department, they would check with you. So every 6 months, every year, they would say, so how's it going? You know, where have you been? And you had to fill out a report book and keep a log of everything you learned, and that would be reviewed by your training officer. And one day, I was in the melting department, or I should say I had been in the melting department and very much liked it. When I walked into that area, there were certain areas like packing and decoration, because we used to decorate the glass, that seemed, I'm going to use the word less manly, you know? And I had this vision of wanting to get in with the big machines and the big side of the process and understand it. And when I saw the big glass melting furnaces, and these things roared. I mean, they roared with all these big oil air burners, and there was cooling air blowing this way and everywhere. And it just, as a young man coming and seeing that with all of these pipes going every which way, it was just very impressive. And when I first saw it, I thought, how on earth do you understand how that process works? How do you begin to learn? Well, of course, it started right there that day. And having gone through that for a month, I moved into another department, and then I bumped into the guy who was the leader of the melting department. And he was an ex-regimental sergeant major in the British Armed Forces. Big, strapping guy with shoulders twice as wide as mine. And he came up and he said, how's it going, lad? And I said, it's going fine, Mr. Brown. He said, did you like the melting? And I said, yes, I loved it. He said, where would you like to work when you've gone through your 3 years? I said, right here in the melting department. He said, come and see me on Monday morning. So I went to see him on the Monday morning, and he gave me a time and everything to be at his office, knocked on his office, went in, and he said, I've got an offer for you. And I said, what's that? He said, I need a shift melting foreman in the experimental furnace area. We're going to be starting up the furnace, and I need somebody to take a shift, which was basically 6 men that would operate the furnace and mix the raw chemicals. And I have to tell you, I mean, I was not a foreman. I did have no supervisory experience. I was 17 and a half years old. I'd been in the business a year and a half, and I was a kid. But I was never, ever going to say no to anything that came through the door. You know, never look a gift horse in the mouth. And he said, are you interested? I said, yes, sir, Mr. Brown. Sign me up. So I started as a supervisor. Made a gazillion mistakes, you know, mostly around interfacing with men, because I was supervising men that were 40, 50-year-old. And here I am, 17 and a half. And it's like me today being supervised by a 17-and-a-half-year-old kid, you know, it's like, it would be difficult. And of course, I got knocked down, not physically, but knocked down or pushed back, you know, because I'd made a mistake and I had to learn through my mistakes. But in retrospect, what a great way to learn, because every single mistake that's been made around man management, trust me, I made it. But I made it early in my career so that I was better equipped later in my career. And that was the beginning of my management role with Corning. And over the years, I just moved through the ranks and got higher and higher until eventually the next move would be, well, where else can we go but the USA, you know? So we came to the USA, yeah.
That's fantastic. So can you explain to me a little bit about what working in the melting department entailed? What did you actually do there? What were the processes that you went through?
Right. So the melting department was really spread out across 2 plants, and one of the first things you did learn to do when you were in the melting department was walk, because simply walking from the furthest furnace on this side to the furthest furnace on the other side was around about 3/4 of a mile just to get there. And of course you were doing all the other walking, climbing, getting up and down. But when I joined there were 7,500 employees in the whole site. And the site was separated basically into 2 major divisions, which were what was called the pressware. And we had a plant in Corning called pressware, and it's self-explanatory. It's glass which is pressed with a hydraulic or pneumatic press, and it spits out 40 plates or 40 cups or 40 casseroles, wherever you're making, approximately per minute. And then there was the blownware factory, which was the other side, which manufactured blown products, and these were hand blown. So anything that had air blown into it to make it or help it form. So we had, in the blownware, we had 3 furnaces. One made large, what is called down draw tubing, which was around about a 10-inch diameter tube, continuous draw, Pyrex glass. And these were used for photo blanks or the chemical industry, where you had to have pipes that could be bent or shaped to move, you know, beer around in a beer manufacturing place, or whiskey or chemicals. And you know, it might be hydrofluoric acid, it might be something that is extremely corrosive and needs a chemically inert glass such as Pyrex to be able to transport that. And then in the center furnace, that was furnace number 1, we called them by number, tank furnace. That's another thing. A tank is what the industry calls a furnace.
Okay.
So technically it's a furnace, but we would call it tank 1, tank 2, tank 3, tank 4, tank 5, tank 6. So tank 1 was the down draw tubing, and tank 2 was the hand blown, and this was where you have all the traditional guys with the metal pipes gathering glass, blowing it into molds, and there was 7 manufacturing forebears, we call them. These are the ports or the holes that allow access to the molten glass. So there were 7 points around the production end of the furnace, and each had a crew of anywhere from 3 to 7 or 8 guys blowing glass, and each guy had a role to play. Sometimes there would be a first gather, which would form, which was called the parison on the end of the gathering iron. And then there would be a second gather on top of that. So the more of those processes that were added, and they were directly related to how large the piece was you were making. So if you were making small pieces, 1 gather. If you were making extremely large pieces, 2 or even 3 gathers of glass. So you had several men that were there doing that part of the process. So that would, the first tank, tank number 1, would manufacture around 25 metric tons of glass per day. The tank 2, which was hand blown, in the time when I first joined there, was 15 metric tons per day. But I and some of the engineers, both in the US and France, were able to extend that in later years. In later decades, we extended that up to 30 metric tons. And then tank number 3 had it had several processes. So it had something called a TCM, which is short for turret chain machine. People in the industry, the old hands in the industry, will recognize that name. And it was called, that's what is a press blow process. Okay. So it manufactured, I don't know if even the coffee cups that we use today, where you put it in your coffee water goes in the top and you catch the coffee underneath, those are made on a TCM, a turret chain machine. And you can manufacture 40 of those per minute on this TCM machine, which is basically, it's kind of a ribbon of glass that goes around, gets pressed and blowed very fast, very noisy. So we had one of those on tank 3, and then we also had an IS machine, which is a machine that is a blowing machine, which in those days was used to make Pyrex baby feeding bottles, which were made of glass. And some of the older mums and dads, mums and pops will remember feeding their children with these, which were made of glass. Now they're probably made of plastic or something like that. And they would have a rubber teat on the end. So this IS machine would make these baby bottles, which sold in tens of thousands, if not millions. And so that was the 2, although there was a third one, there was a velo tubing machine, which was a process designed to make smaller bore tubing. So whereas the down draw made 10-inch Pyrex tubing, the velo would manufacture anything from capillary tubing, which is what is used on a mercury thermometer, that very thin glass tubing, up to around about inch and a half, something that's, you know, about the diameter of a fluorescent light tube. It wasn't used to make fluorescent light tubes. It was used to make measuring cylinders that you would see perhaps in a laboratory at a university. That tubing is Pyrex, or nowadays is a Pyrex equivalent, not manufactured by Corning anymore. And so that was what that turbine was used for. So kind of industrial chemical applications rather than household commercial applications. And so that was the 3 furnaces in the blownware factory. Now in the pressware factory you had 2 furnaces, and this factory manufactured the pressware, and so one furnace manufactured plates, Pyrex plates, casseroles, or you'd have like a 1.5 pint casserole, a 2 pint casserole, 3 pint, and each press had its size limitations on what it could make. So you'd have a large press that would manufacture the large casseroles, etc., an intermediate press that would manufacture the medium size, and then a small press that would manufacture the smaller items. And these would run anywhere up to, again, around about 40 pieces per minute. Seemed like 40 was the limit at how fast you could make things, and the larger it was, the slower it was. So if you made 40 items that was, say, a cup size, that was going about as fast as the technology would allow. But if you wanted to manufacture a large casserole, then it might go down to 18 or 20 pieces per minute. And a lot of that was driven by the fact that you had to cool the glass down, because glass is like a super cool liquid in a way. And when you need to make something small, you need to have the glass very hot, because it needs to be cut and it needs to stay fluid and malleable until it gets to the point where it's formed into whatever it's going to be formed. And so when you manufacture a big piece, you need a much larger gob of glass, and if it was so hot, then it would just run away. It would be like water, if you like, and what you want it to be like is like molasses. You want it to be slow, and so when you cut it, you can get it down to the manufacturing piece. And so we'd had a furnace there that were manufacturing the casseroles, and this was what was called a high expansion Pyrex glass, in so much that it didn't have to be reconnected or rejoined to anything after it was made. So a plate, it's pressed, it's thermally processed, then it's good to use. In the blownware factory where we're making chemical and industrial application glass, you would quite often make tubing that was 6 foot long, then you'd have to cut it into 12-inch pieces, weld a foot onto it, put scribes on it to say this is the graduation. You'd have to calculate all of that. So there's a lot of afterwork with the industrial glass, cutting, welding, joining, and that's where that was a lower expansion Pyrex, because you wanted it to be able to be reheated, joined, thermally cut, and thermally welded, and then cooled down and be thermally conditioned without cracking, without fracturing. And so that's why we needed a lower expansion glass. In the higher expansion commercial glassware, the domestic glass, you didn't do that cutting and joining, so the expansion wasn't that critical. So we typically called it the high expansion and the low expansion glasses. So that was one of the furnaces in the pressware. The second furnace was manufacturing white Pyrex glass, or what was called opal glass. And so it was primarily made, or it was invented for use in hospitals and canteens and industrial applications. It was extremely strong. I mean, you could pick a cup up and throw it across the floor and it wouldn't break, most times. And obviously putting it in sinks and washing it by hand. We didn't have dishwashers, and doing it on an industrial scale in hospitals, it needed to be strong and utilitarian. It wasn't the prettiest of glass, and it wasn't the prettiest of cup and saucer or whatever it was being used to make, but it did last, and it was very, very strong. And I have in my house glass that was given to me by my mother, that was given to her by her grandmother, or by her mother, my grandmother, her mother, which has lasted forever. And it's scratched and scoured, but it's still functional. And that was the appeal to Pyrex glass. And that furnace, again, had 3 presses, and again, we would have white casseroles and we would have clear Pyrex casseroles. Sometimes we'd have a white casserole with a clear lid on top of it, so we'd make the lid on one furnace and the casserole on another furnace. We made a gazillion cups and saucers. And again, there were all these hydraulic or pneumatic presses. And manufacturing up to 40 a minute. And in later years, we put in a spinning process, which actually spun the mold. So there was no pressing taking place. It was centrifugal force that pushed the glass out. But that was in later years. I'm talking about the early 70s now, and that didn't come in, I think, until 86. But those were the two glasses that were manufactured in pressware. And it was turning out a lot of tonnage of glass going out of there. And a long history of Pyrex at that facility. Yep. Need a drink, drying up.
Sure. So you showed me your kind of a list of positions that you had, and it does seem like you moved up, pretty regularly. You'd move up, but most often still in the melting department. So was your job to supervise, to make sure that the glass melted properly and was ready for these pieces to be made? What did you do in your position on a daily basis?
Okay, so as a shift foreman, which was basically my first foray into the management role, you basically are on a 3-shift system. So you one day you might be starting at 6 in the morning and work till 2 in the afternoon. Then you'll rotate and you might be doing night shifts. But you always had the same crew that followed you, so you were all on the same cycle. And my role as shift foreman was to make sure that the melting process, in terms of temperatures, in terms of how much glass was being put into the furnace, that it was being put in correctly, that the burners and everything were firing correctly. And I didn't physically do that myself. I had furnace operators that would do that. But it was my job to oversee their function and make sure they were doing it correctly. And you also have to deal with the glass quality. So if there's a problem with the temperature and the guy can't make the glass correctly, he'll soon let you know. And then you have to problem solve that and figure out why it's not where it should be, get that fixed or fix it yourself, and make sure that the process and production was able to continue. It was a continuous process. So time was money, and you couldn't afford for something not to be functioning and not to be working correctly as it needed to be. And I would say the biggest thing that concerned me as a shift foreman would be that temperatures were maintained, that the amount of glass in the furnace was maintained correctly, and that the structure of the furnace was not being compromised. It was if the process is not managed correctly, you can have a burner, for instance, that could be suddenly get a piece of carbon which would deflect the flame, and instead of heating the glass, it would hit an internal part of the structure of the furnace and would literally melt right through it, and you would have a serious problem. The worst case would be that you would have to take the furnace down and repair that, which would mean millions of pounds. So you had a huge responsibility, even as what I would say the junior ranks of management as a shift foreman. You still had a huge responsibility for the asset, which was the furnace. I mean, the people are always a great asset, so you had to make sure that they were operating in a safe manner. But again, the process itself was a huge expense and a huge asset. So you had to make sure that that was controlled correctly and was not in danger of being damaged. And it did happen. I mean, it happened from time to time that things would get damaged and there would be a big inquest, and you just made sure it wasn't happening on your shift, And then as I moved through the ranks, I mean, it seemed, looking back, and when I catalogued the jobs I'd done, it seemed like every 2 or 3 years I was getting promoted, and basically that's the way it was. I'd come in with, I would say, a standard level of education. I'd proven myself academically by getting the diploma at Corning, and I was basically proving myself just by the function of doing the job they gave me. So they would give me a job, and I realized I was being tested, and it was always more responsibility, and just let's see how he copes with this, And it seems like I coped well, and they would come along and say, how do you fancy taking on this? And I'd say, well, in addition to this, and they'd say, yeah. And so I'd end up with a larger group or a larger area of responsibility, and I continued doing that until basically I got within striking distance of the top job, which was the plant manager. but my aspirations didn't go in that direction. I liked the business I was in around melting, and I wanted, there was area within the company, albeit outside of the UK, to advance within that discipline. And rather than stay in the Sunderland plant and say, well, let's wait and see if I can get that job, which you might not, you might not, or do I want to go and explore the adventure further afield, which is what I chose to do. But I did progress through many levels, and from time to time they would try me out of my comfort zone, which is something Corning likes to do. And they're just trying to find and define your limits and say, oh, he's great at this, would he be great at that over there, or great at this over there? So we kind of defined my limits. For a period of time I was responsible for the production side. And I remember that one of the US senior managers came over. He came over as a plant manager, a man by the name of Don McCabe, who a lot of Corning people will recognize that name because he was president of manufacturing when he retired last year, amongst other things. And he and I became great friends, and still are to this day. But when Don came over, he came over as plant manager of the Sunderland blown-wire plant, and he shook it around a bit. You know, he changed things around him. He put me in charge of production because melting was running so well. He thought, I will try this guy in production. It didn't suit me, and I think Don realized that. So I went back to melting. It was enjoyable. It gave me an exposure to a different set of concerns, a different set of responsibilities. But we all have our abilities, and our abilities from time to time are defined. You know, you can be great as an apple grower, but you're not necessarily going to be great at growing bananas, you know. So it helped me define that. But I did progress through the ranks, and I can literally say with my hand on my heart, when I left Sunderland, I knew every brick and every mouse hole and every roof tile in that building. And I'd grown up man and boy there. And the other thing I would say, which was great about working in Sunderland, it's a little bit different than working in the US, because the US is a big place. And when you come over here, you're a little fish in a big pond. And when you're in a plant in Sunderland, which had 140 people when I left, you're a big fish in a little pond. And so there was a difference as I moved up through the ranks. When I came over here, it was different, but absolutely enjoyable, and stretched me again in a different way, and helped me grow and develop. Yeah.
Great. Well, you actually just touched on another one of the things I'm interested in. So how is workplace culture different in the Sunderland factory versus in working in Corning, New York?
Wow, that's a brilliant question, and it's I wouldn't say it's a difficult question to answer, because everything is different. It was I had worked in melting at the time I left. I'd worked there for 28 years. And part of my job in I would say my last 10 years in Sunderland was helping at a high level to maintain the quality of several furnaces. And there was always a saying, you know, when you had 7 furnaces, 6 of them can be running great, but you can guarantee on any one day, one of them is not going to be doing what it's supposed to, and you've got to work on that one. And so all of your energy would be going to that area which needed the remedial work. And part of my function was to call on resources from Corning's worldwide network. So I had developed over the 28 years there a huge network of colleagues that were disciplined in several areas. So you might have someone who was a defect analysis expert, someone who was a melting expert or a batching expert, so because some of the problems can come from the preparation of the raw materials as opposed to the melting of the materials. You would have refractory experts. So the refractories are the bricks and the mortar that go together to make the furnaces. So you would have all of these disciplines, electrical experts, because we use electric in the process of melting. And so from time to time I would have to either come to the US and attend seminars or interface with colleagues on a particular problem. But invariably I would be bringing them over to where the problem was and saying, okay, I need X, Y, and Z to come over and help me work through this problem, and they would come over. So you built a great camaraderie, a kind of a brotherhood, if you like, because these people were kind of like I am today. They'd spent their whole lives. They were older men than me. In some cases, because I was calling on the US, in some cases there were women, because this was an exposure to me, saying, hey, you know, it's not always men that have those exciting jobs. I was getting exposure to women as well in the business, which was great. I mean, that was not a problem for me. And so I built this huge network, and it was either I drew on resources from France and from the US, from MT&E, which is just across the road here. So I was exposed to, and getting back to your question, I was exposed culturally to the differences, and meeting female engineers and specialists was a part of that. And coming over here was an exposure to the US way of working, and spending a week or two around folks in the Decker building opened your eyes to a different way of doing things. So when I came here, it wasn't as big a culture shock as if I'd never been here. But to answer your question in a material way, being in England is a much, much more, I was going to use the word relaxed, but that's not the right word. Liberal is the phrase to use. So we're talking about a different time in a way. Even though, you know, it's 14 years since I came to the US, it was different then, 14 years ago in England, to what it is now in England. But there were so many things, just so much more liberal in. So I'll give you an example if I can. So Christmas parties. Christmas parties were something which was very much enjoyed in the Sunderland plant. And when I came here, Christmas parties were enjoyed here. So being an Englishman in a plant, and you have all levels are invited to the Christmas party. It doesn't matter whether you're the plant manager or the person that cleans out the toilets and the shower blocks, you're all invited to the Christmas party. Never was a question about that. And so you would go there, and everybody would be looking forward to that. And it would be, you know, a day or two before the plant would shut down for Christmas, because production stopped over the Christmas period. Even though the furnaces were going and my guys were still working and I was still on call, those guys were that worked in the manufacturing side, they would be shut down, and they would go on a week or 2 weeks vacation for Christmas. So we would have this Christmas party two days before that would happen, and I would try and release as many of my guys as I could, and try and work it so that if you didn't get the Christmas party this year, we would fix it so you got there the next year, because invariably somebody had to be in the plant to maintain the furnaces. And so we would go there, and it literally was, you know, if you were the plant manager, you had 4 stars on your lapel or whatever it was, to use a military analogy, or whether you carried a brush when you did your job, there was no rank. Everybody was the same. Everybody invariably got drunk. I mean, it was a drinking culture in England. A very much, think of something like Pittsburgh steel workers, you know, working in a very industrialized area. Those guys, I'm sure, love their beer, you know. And so it was in England. And so it would be, and you know, the ladies would get dressed up to the nines, you know, the shortest of skirts, the highest of, and everybody was just out to strut their stuff, have a great time, and you would roll in home completely drunk at 1 o'clock in the morning, and you would know that everybody had a great time. And I never felt conscious of my rank when I was there. I never felt like, geez, you're the manager, you have to set a good example, you know, you have to be just 2 drinks and make sure that everybody gets home safe and well and all that stuff. You were just enjoying it, you know. And we would have a band, and there'd be food and dancing and all that, you know, you'd be dancing with everybody and anybody. So now we come to the US here. And my first exposure to a Christmas party was, oh, we're having a Christmas party. And I'm thinking, great, you know, let's have a Christmas party. And I go there, and there was about 3 times as many people at this party as there was when I was at the plant. So it was a very much bigger venue, a very much bigger setting. And I'm expecting everybody to, you know, get a bottle of wine and have a dance, you know, and dance with everybody. But no, it was almost like I was on duty. I felt like everybody was watching what you were doing and minding their P's and Q's, as we say in England, and being ever so politically correct, and a sense of tension, a sense of being watched. And all of the managers were there, and everybody was dressed nicely. Everybody had a suit and tie on, and the ladies had their best dresses on. But everybody was oh so controlled, and I thought, this is not a Christmas party. This is like a business event, you know. And afterwards, I came out, and I had a few friends who were, you know, my sponsors, and who I could really open up to and just be myself. And I said, well, what was going on there, you know? Nobody said, oh no, you know. And I told them what a Christmas party was like in England. They said, no, we wouldn't do anything. We might have done that 20 or 30 years ago, but we don't do that now, you know. And that was a cultural shock for me. I didn't realize that, because I was going there ready to let loose and dance with all the ladies and the secretaries and have a fun night, you know. And no, you don't do that, you know. Be a good boy, you know, and we'll be leaving at 10:30, and okay, yes sir, you know. So that was if I could use that as a demonstration of how it was different, and that would be the same in several other aspects of the culture, I would say. Of course, there are a lot of things which are very similar. You know, we speak the same language. What was it? Was it Churchill said that we are a people divided by a common language, or something like that? And so it was, even the language could get you into trouble at times, because there are certain phrases and certain words which mean completely the different in the UK. So you had to educate yourself, and working in the area I was working in, I didn't feel like I was under a microscope or anything. I felt like people drew some humour from that. There certainly is a honeymoon period, as they call, where you come in and everybody's fascinated with you because you're different. And then that slowly wears off. So in that fascination time, you're learning and you're making faux pas and mistakes, and they're correcting you and they're having a laugh and all that stuff. But then after a while, you're expected to know this stuff, you know, and this is how to behave in America, you know. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So I know you said, and I think this was before we had started recording, was that you had wanted to come over to the U.S. You had decided that, I think you said that was where the job you wanted really was. Right. And that it took a little while. Yes. So so once you got over here, what was your job, and what did you get to do? Okay.
So I came over here. I mean, I was, I think, the second most senior manager in the plant when I left. And came over here and accepted a job which was a better salary and you know, all of that kind of good stuff. But I wasn't a manager in so much as I had people who reported to me. My title was a manager, but I was what was called as a functional manager. So I was a manager of a melting, not even a melting process, but I was at a manager level to assist in the resolution of melting issues within the Cornian Empire, wherever that might be, this side of the world or the other. But it was recognized, that was a stated goal of mine, that I wanted to be a manager of people. That's what I enjoyed. I'd gone through a period of my life where learning the process and learning the technicalities was my first hurdle. And as I got more proficient in that, I got to a place where it became second nature. Not that you know everything at any one time in your life, you're always learning, but it became that I knew the technology. And the challenge I always found in later years of my life was around the people, especially when you were trying to have British, American and French people work together. There are cultural differences. There are differences in how you approach people, in how you communicate. And one style of communication might upset another style. So I was learning at that point, hey, this is exciting, finding how to get this team of people to work together and maximize their sums or their capabilities as a sum of the total will be greater than the individuals, you know. And so when I came here, I was as an individual performer, no team reporting to me, and I said, well, I want to be someone who has a team. And they said, okay, but we want to. We know you've got this great reputation in England. We know you've been a senior manager over there, and you've got this record of being promoted all the time. But we want to see it for ourselves. You know, it wasn't said in so many words, but that was the impression. We like to see you perform before we give you a responsibility, which I could totally agree with. Don't give me a team of people, you know, not knowing whether he'll be able to adapt culturally to the different ways of managing folks. And so I did perform as an individual performer in this kind of operational manager's role. I think it was a year and a half. And my first year here, I don't know if you still do PD&Rs or whether you have PD&Rs here. A bittersweet pill, I would say, PD&Rs. People who are retired do not miss PD&Rs. But my first PD&R here in the US here, I got the highest mark possible, and my boss was like, wow, I've never seen anybody get far exceeds in their first year. And that did a lot to prove my capabilities to my then boss. And 6 months after that, he came, as he usually did, a great guy by the name of Dr. Bob Thomas, and said, you got a minute? And when he said that, you knew, oh, something's coming. And we went from there to another senior manager's office, and he said, this guy wants to sit and talk to you for a while. And basically he offered me a job as the manager of the heat treatment group, which is a group of folks that build the layers, that do all of the thermal processing for all of Corning's products. It was predominantly at that time, it was around the substrates for automotive, so out of diesel and Irwin and that kind of stuff. And I recognized that it was a step, again, outside of my comfort zone. It wasn't melting glass. Mm-hmm. It wasn't anything to do with batch and chemicals, and it was all to do with a different aspect, but with strong similarities. Thermal processing, mixing of batches, etc., and raw materials. So I did that, and did that for, I think it was about 3 or 4 years. And then the same boss came along and said, I want you to take over the melting engineering and bulk material handling group. So I took over that, which was more in line with what my core discipline was. And really enjoyed that. Each job has had its challenges, but those years of managing those two groups were very memorable and very pleasant and very enjoyable. I have fond memories of that. And then my next step after that was retirement.
Yeah, that's right.
So I came over and did those two core functions, and then it was kind of, Corning was going through one of those cyclical downturns, and they offered retirement packages to a certain group of people. You had to be of a certain age with a certain amount of service. And I was 53, I just scraped in, but I had 36 years active service at that time. So I made the cut in terms of qualifying for the package offer, and it was, shall we just say, it was an offer too good to refuse, and I've not looked back, you know. So that's basically what I came over here and did. And in those jobs, especially the last job of being the bulk material handling and melting engineering manager, that took me around the world, and especially to Asia, where CDT had their core manufacturing businesses, although they did have some here in Kentucky. So a lot of travel, and not so much for me, but for my group. My group seemed to travel all over, so you would never have, your group would never at any one time be right in the office. At least 50, if not 70 or 80% of them would be overseas with support people here trying to support them. So you'd find yourself, if you weren't traveling, you'd find yourself on the end of a phone after you got back from work with late night conference calls and conference calls on a weekend. So it seems like all the jobs I had were never a 9 to 5 job, especially when you were looking after furnaces, because it was a constant level of contact 7/24. And I remember getting phone calls on Christmas Day, just about to cut the turkey, which was the traditional dish in England, and the phone would go and there'd be a problem, and you had to leave your family and everything and go and fix the problem and then come back 2 or 3 hours later. Seems like being in that melting environment always meant you were not at home, you know.
Right.
So retirement, being at home is a very enjoyable thing.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a
Yeah.
pleasure.
Yeah.
So you had you have your 40-year service pin.
Yep.
Been 40 years with Corning.
Mhm.
How did the company change over the decades that you worked with them?
Okay, so it has gone through an evolution, and of course there was a culture and an evolution of management in the UK, which was different to the US, and even in the time that I've been here, the US culture has changed, and I'm not expressing whether it's good or bad. I'm just recognizing the differences. So I'll give you an example. When I was in the UK. We got the word that Jamie Horton was coming for a visit. And we had some pretty high-profile visitors in that plant. We had Jimmy Carter, the president of the USA, came to visit that plant one time. But this particular day, Jamie was coming. And we used to get flyers and communications from across the pond, as we called it, that would show Jamie, you know, with his what we call suspenders, we called braces. So he would have his fashionable braces on there. And so it was a kind of an iconic character, you know, and you could easily recognize him by his braces. So this particular day, me being a smart aleck, we say that, I thought, I'm going to wear my braces. And we were told that, you know, this is the path that Jamie will come, and if you want to shake hands with him, you better be standing on that path. So that path wasn't in the melting area. I had to come round to the manufacturing area, and there I am standing with my braces, or suspenders as you guys call them, and Jamie walks past with his tie on and his suit and everything, you know, and he saw me and he looked and he came over and he grabbed them and twanged them and said, "Nice suspenders there, buddy." And I said, "Oh, hi Jamie, nice to meet you." He said, "What's your name?" I said, "Dave Stafford." He said, "Oh, nice to meet you, Dave." And literally that amount of time, and he moved on. So that was in about the early 90s, mid 90s. So fast forward approximately 2005, 10 years later, I'm sitting in a glass office in Decker Building, and it's Christmas time, and the word is out that Jamie's coming around to say hi to everybody at Christmas. And it might have been before 2005, maybe 2 or 3 or something like that, but when Jamie was still the guy at the top. And again, I thought, I'll wear those suspenders, you know, so I had a pair of suspenders on. I was just in my shirt and tie. I always wore a tie. Being English, it's a trait of Englishmen to wear suits and ties. And Jamie walked past the window, and I thought, oh, there's Jamie. And the person who I was with, I said, oh, there's Jamie Horton walking by. And he walked on by, and I thought, oh, he didn't see us, you know. But then the door opened, and which was behind me, and I turned around, and Jamie walked in, and he goes, "Dave,
Oh my gosh.
Sunderland." And I was like, whoa. I said, Jamie, I shook his hand, I said, "Merry Christmas." I said, "I have no idea how you ever did that."
Yeah.
I said, "That is very impressive." And he just had a name recognition and a head that must be like a filing cabinet, you know. But I was very impressed, and he was like, you know, "Merry Christmas, great to see what you're doing over here," and all that kind of thing. And he was interested. And shall we just say that that doesn't happen today? It's more run as a business, whereas then I felt part of a family. Now I think it's more of a business, and is it making a profit, and do we need to do this or that for the right reasons for business? And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing. Perhaps that's what Corning needed to be successful. But it's certainly an observation that certainly I think the old hands in Corning recognise and to a degree lament. But it is a difference. And, you know, all power to Wendell Weeks and all that good stuff and the company. But it's just a cultural change. And I think Wendell would recognise that and say, well, that needed to happen. And he would know better than me.
Right.
Yes.
All right. Well, I think our time is almost up. So is there anything else that you wanted to talk about briefly? Anything you wanted to mention? No,
just the fact, you know, we talked about how long Pyrex had been connected with Sunderland, and it really went back to 1922 when a guy by the name of Ernest Purser Jobling found out that Corning were manufacturing Pyrex, and he came over and bought a license to manufacture it in Sunderland.
Okay.
And that's when Pyrex was first manufactured in the UK. And now that was in between the First War and the Second War in 1922. I think 1923 is when the first glass was melted. But we can get into that some more, but certainly a long history getting on now for nearly 100 years of history in there in Sunderland. But it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, it's been great talking to you. Lots of good stories.
Yeah.
All right.
Right, great.
Well, thank you very much.
Yep, you're welcome.